market movers. This is The Pulse with Francine Lacqua.
Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to The Pulse. I'm Francine Lacqua here in London. Now, Andy Burnham is set to become Britain's 7th Prime Minister in a decade today. He'll be hindering a cascade of challenges that have felled his predecessors with a number of outstanding questions about his cabinet and, of course, policy direction. Well, for more, let's bring in our Daybreak Europe anchor, Lizzie Burden, who joins us from Downing Street. So, Lizzie, what can we actually expect today?
Well, Francine, the world's press are gathered to watch Starmer out, Burnham in today, and it has been a remarkable journey, a bloodless coup in the Labour Party, but he is set to become Prime Minister, the first since 1963, Alec Douglas Home, to come from outside the House of Commons and straight into Downing Street. He's the 11th of the past 19 British Prime Ministers to take office without an election. He's got a working majority of 166 MPs, and 90% of them backed him to become Prime Minister. So today we're going to expect the same choreography that we've become all too familiar with over the past decade. Starmer will give a farewell speech here outside that famous black door. Then he'll go to Buckingham Palace to tender his resignation to King Charles. The King will then invite Burnham to formally form a government. Burnham will be back here. He'll be at the lectern setting out his policy objectives, and then the ministers will start filing down Downing Street as the cabinet appointments begin. The crucial one for us, of course, is who will be the Chancellor. The front runner, according to press reports, is Shabana Mahmood. Let's see if that's confirmed, because there could be huge reaction in Gilts and Sterling if it's somebody else like Ed Miliband, who was formerly thought to be the front runner. Of course, he is the Energy Secretary.
Lizzie, thank you so much. Lizzie Burden there outside number 10. Now, rising energy costs will be one of the key focuses for Andy Burnham. Joining us now is Isabelle Mateos, Lago, Group Chief Economist at BNP Paribas. Isabelle, thank you so much for being here. I mean, look, we look at the UK, and this could, I don't know how much of the focus will be on the UK, given it's also a big earnings week. But what are the main challenges that the new Prime Minister has to face that will actually decide whether investors go in or not?
Good morning, Francine. Yes, I think he's got a heavy agenda in front of him. I think the good thing is he hasn't made any lofty promises, and so in a way he's got a relatively free hand to choose his priorities. I think the risk for him is that the international agenda is going to dominate immediately. Already we're facing potentially a new energy price shock, which is going to call for how can you ease the cost of living. That was already one of his agenda items. Now it's going to be harder, and of course he's under tight surveillance from bond markets in particular. I think the issue of bringing back equity investors, frankly, is going to be that's more of a long-term issue, and the UK hasn't done so badly, but the immediate question is going to be how to keep the bond market in check. And I think that's why there's been so much focus on who's going to be the next chancellor, because he hasn't said very much about policy plans, and so people default to personnel as policy. The reality is we really don't know. I think he's understood that he's under close watch, and that's why he's vowed to stick by the fiscal rules. Nevertheless, how do you boost growth without touching the fiscal rules? That's going to be very tricky.
I was going to ask you, actually, is there really a way of not touching the fiscal rules and kickstarting growth that has, frankly, been anemic in the UK?
So I think, look, at the macro level, it's going to be very hard. Now, there is flexibility somewhat within the fiscal rules to tweak the allocation of spending between different items. But I think probably if he wants some quick wins, it's not going to be aiming to, shift growth from 1% to 1 and some decimals. It's going to be making people feel it a bit more among the Labour electorate, because there's been a real disconnect. It's very striking. I spent a lot of time looking at the Eurozone and looking at the UK economy. Frankly, they're not that different. If anything, the UK economy has outperformed in some dimensions, and yet the narrative here has been consistently negative, one of poor performance. And so I think he can try to, take what's good and try to shift a little bit where the growth is felt in the country, and that could help him move forward with a longer-term agenda.
Isabelle, going back to the oil price, because, I mean, the Lacqua household, I'm putting everyone on a train to go to continental Europe in August because we were concerned about the price of oil and the fact that we were running out of it, or certainly for planes and jet planes, jet fuel. Where are we? Because it's unclear whether we've looked through it, whether, demands, is it that that China's using much more Russia demand? I mean, should we worry now or not that it's coming back?
Well, where are we, I think, is the number one question for everybody watching what's happening in the Gulf. And that's what central bankers meeting this week and next are also going to be asking. The reality is inventories have been depleted. Compared to the last round of skirmishes in the Gulf, and actually when you look at the so-called crack spread, the price of products, diesel and jet fuel, they are at record highs. So it's not just that crude oil price has gone back up; it's that this crack spread is very tight, and that reflects tightness in the physical market. So. We're at risk of prices really moving much higher in order to bring demand down. We haven't really faced that until now, but that's why the question of where is this escalation going is so important. The previous rounds of skirmishes were resolved relatively quickly, but this time we don't really see a de-escalation path, and neither side is messaging that they're keen to keep talking. So I think markets are going to get tighter and tighter, and maybe that's what will ultimately put pressure back on the two sides to talk.
Isabelle, thank you so much. Isabelle Mateos Lago from BNP Paribas stays with us. We'll come back and we'll talk a lot more about earnings and some of also what we're seeing in the U.S. economy. Coming up, we're also back at Farnborough International Airshow with Kelly Ortberg, the chief executive of Boeing. Don't miss that interview. It's coming up next, and this is Bloomberg. A major event in the air industry calendar as the Farnborough International Airshow kicks off today. Well, Bloomberg's Guy Johnson is there with the top guest. Guy.
Francine, thank you very much indeed. Yes, Kelly Ortberg is here at Farnborough, the CEO of Boeing. Great to see you.
Good to see you.
Thanks for taking the time. Look, Kelly, you're 2 years in, nearly 2 years in, as CEO of Boeing. Company feels like it's in much better shape. The share price is well off its lows. You've ticked a whole load of boxes. Are the priorities beginning to change? It feels like a company that's kind of shifting to offense, to kind of getting on the front foot.
Well, we're turning the corner. I tell my team we haven't quite finished turning the corner. We've got more work to do, but I am pleased with the progress so far. We're ramping up production across many of our product lines. Markets are very strong, so our backlog is very strong. So our story is really focusing on executing that backlog.
Okay. The administration, the White House, has given you massive support over the last 18 months. The President certainly had your back. Do you think the company would be where it is now, that kind of progress that you've made, without that kind of support?
Well, I think the execution focus is really on us to go improve our overall performance, build trust with our stakeholders, restore trust with the regulator. And I think that's more what Boeing has done for themselves. The president has been very helpful in sales campaigns. Balancing trade, the best way to do that is buy a bunch of airplanes. And so we've been a beneficiary of that. He's been very helpful to the whole aerospace industry.
So you're in a good place right now.
Yes.
So what's now?
Well, we still have to ramp up higher. So we're at 47 a month now on the 737. We have aspirations to get to 63 a month rate. We're at 8 a month rate on the 787. We want to go to 10 later in the year and then higher next year. So we're investing in new capacity, new facilities so that we can continue this rate ramp. The backlog is there. The market is strong. So it's all about delivering more airplanes.
You say the backlog is there. The market is strong. You like the economy right now? The consumer looks good, particularly in the States. The consumer wants to fly. The airlines are certainly saying that. But you've got Brent this morning at $90 a barrel. You've got the ongoing conflict with Iran. Kind of just give me your flavor of what you're seeing in front of you in terms of what the macro picture looks like.
It's a super resilient market, and while we always see perturbations here or there, regional perturbations, which we're seeing now, we forecast that the market's going to continue to be strong. Traffic continues to grow. We just came out with the new forecast for overall aircraft growth, and we see 44,000 airplanes in the next 20 years. So this isn't a market that moves quickly, because you have to make orders for aircraft well in advance, and we think that the demand is set for our aircraft going forward.
One of the things that's certainly driving the economy right now is the AI boom.
Yep.
A lot of money's being spent.
Yep.
Do you think it's going to be worth it?
Oh, yeah, I do. AI is critically important to us. We're working with AI to either improve our back office processes, help us with our design processes, whether it's software or hardware designs, and also embedding AI capability in our services and our actual product going forward. So I think AI is going to really change the way we do our work, and hopefully we can go faster and provide better products as a result of the AI.
One of the things that often goes hand in hand, is with the AI story is the robotics story, like advanced robotics. It feels like Boeing is a perfect place for maybe that advanced robotics to find a home. What do you see in the future for that? Can you build airplanes without people? What impact is it going to have? What does it do in terms of your ability to manufacture?
Today we use robotics to help us build the aircraft, but the real opportunity to really utilize robotics is going to be when we go to a next aircraft, because in many cases you have to change the design to allow for the automation, and I think that the real step function in automation will come with the next generation aircraft.
Okay, we'll come on to when that is in just a moment.
Okay.
But in terms of how you utilize that, how much of the aircraft do you think you can build? Like how automated do you think this process could be?
I think we can make a step function in automation. Depends on what particular area of the aircraft, but certainly we can automate the whole assembly of the aircraft in a big way.
Okay, you bring up the issue of the next generation of aircraft. When am I going to see it?
Don't know yet. The market is not quite ready for the new airplane. The customers are telling us, let's focus on the existing product. We'd like to see better durability of that product in the marketplace.
Yep.
And as I mentioned, we've got big backlogs, and they're looking for us to deliver on those backlogs. We are studying a new airplane, and we'll be ready when the market's ready.
So this is the replacement for the current 737.
In that family,
kind of the narrow body kind of end of the spectrum. Your friends in Toulouse think early next decade. You think that's a little early?
I think the market will tell us what the right timing is. That it's not today. Whether it's the end of the next decade, we'll see.
Okay. Are you in a position now that you could make that happen?
Probably not now financially. I'd say we need another couple years as we ramp up our production, improve our positive cash flow, and pay down some debt, and that's our plan, and we're accomplishing that plan. So in a couple years, we'll be ready to take on that challenge. I don't think the market's going to quite be ready in a couple years, but we'll see. We want to be ready when the market's ready.
Okay. But your sense is that that's at the back end of next decade?
Yeah, in that neighborhood, I think so.
Okay, let's talk about engines. We'll talk about current engines and maybe future engines. Let's start with the future engines. Larry Culp over at GE tells me that it's going to be an open fan system, unlike the jet engine that's flying over us right now. Have you made a decision on what you think the next engine is going to be? Because this is going to be kind of critical to what that aircraft is going to look and feel like.
No, we haven't made the decision on exactly what the next engine is going to be. We're studying all sorts of technology, including the GE technology you're talking about, and we'll make that decision at the appropriate time.
Okay. Let's talk about defense, because that feels actually, for the first time actually I can remember a long time, Farnborough feels like it's more focused on defense and the outlook on that side than it is maybe on the civil side. Can Europe rearm and do what it needs to do without the big American prime contractors, the OEMs like Boeing? Can it do that? Europe wants to do its rearmament program with its own capability. Do you think that's possible?
I think in certain areas it's possible, and it's going to take time. And so I think that we're going to still have opportunities to participate in the market as that capability gets built up here. I don't think that they can afford to do it everywhere, so they're going to have to pick their spots. What we think is we'll have to partner more to address the markets in Europe, and we're willing and ready to do that.
What does that look like?
Well, it looks like joint ventures, partnerships. We're partnered with Rheinmetall, for example, to bring the MQ-28 into Germany. We're partnered with BAE here in the UK in trainer aircraft. So that's what that looks like. Partnerships with in-country companies that have capability, and we can bring our capability and address this market.
Do you think there has been a paradigm shift, though? Do you think there has been? Are we in a new world now in terms of the long-term trend? Europe has not prioritized its defense industry for many years. Has that now changed?
Yeah, I think it has. Budgets have increased significantly, and as budgets increase, the opportunity will increase. So I think it'll take time, and our plan is to work with countries and companies to address the market as the market transitions.
Does that mean M&A, or does that mean the partnerships that you're talking about?
I think it's predominantly partnerships right now. It may lead to M&A later, but I think for right now it's mostly going to be partnerships.
And where do you see the opportunity for Boeing in that?
Really, all of our product lines, I think, have application, whether it be our rotary wing platforms, our E7 platform is another important program here in the UK, our MQ-28, our training airplane.
Yep.
So we've got a lot of applications where that capability just doesn't reside standalone here in Europe. So I think we can partner with European companies and bring that capability into the market.
And in terms of where the challenges lie within that, over the last few years, we spent a lot of time talking about the civil supply chain. Does the same problem exist in defense?
Yeah, in many cases, the defense supply chain is pretty common to the civil supply chain when you get down into the tier 2 and tier 3. So we are in an environment where both markets are growing at the same time. And that's going to constrain the supply chain. And we're spending a lot of effort and money helping our supply chain be ready as we grow. They've got a lot of work yet to do because rates are going to continue to increase at both Boeing and our competitors.
So just to wrap things up, you feel like the company's in a good place. So we've got earnings coming up in the next few days. But in terms of what you have delivered thus far, you are comfortable that you've made the progress that you've needed to make?
Yeah, absolutely. We're making progress. I feel good. Our employees feel good. Our customers are feeling better about the Boeing company. Our regulator, if you just saw, just recently gave us a delegation for ticketing our commercial airplanes. So we're restoring that trust step by step, and I feel really good about where we are.
Kelly, it's been great to see you. Thank you very much indeed for giving us some time this morning. We really appreciate it.
Okay, thank you.
Kelly Ortberg, the CEO of Boeing. Francine, in London, back to you.
Guy, thank you so much. Guy Johnson there and Kelly Ortberg, the chief executive of Boeing. And of course, Guy will be all day at the Farnborough Airshow. Guy will be speaking to the biggest players in the business, including Guillaume Faury, the Airbus chief executive. Don't miss that interview, 9:30 a.m. New York time, 2:30 p.m. London time. And that gives us a very good picture and idea of some of the rivalries between the European group and the Boeing. Now, still with us, Mateos Lago, Isabelle Mateos Lago, group chief economist at BNP Paribas. Isabelle, thank you so much for sticking around. When you look at, some of the forces that were, talking, it was Iran, there's U.S., China, but there's also this, underlying earnings question about AI. How does that impact the economy?
Well, for me, the underlying story is this capex cycle, capex super cycle, you could call it, which is happening in AI, but it's happening in defense and airspace. And I'm sure you're going to hear a lot of very bullish CEOs all day telling you that their order books are full, and it's infrastructure and it's electrification, and so it's actually quite broad-based. And this is what we saw in PMIs last month. Of course, we'll get a new set at the end of this week, but I think we're going to see a confirmation of that in earnings, that it's not just AI, actually, that across the entire economy, mostly manufacturing, but not just, you're seeing a lot of dynamism, despite Iran. Now, of course, if we get a new leg to that energy shock, that could challenge a little bit that narrative. And I think market watchers and economists are going to be listening very very closely at how the corporates are gauging the rest of the year. But for now, everything we see in the data is frankly pretty strong, and again a testament to that resilience in the economy despite the energy shock and despite the uncertainty.
But so is this really based on capex? So is it infrastructure spending, and is there a real worry, a real risk that it doesn't materialize in terms of revenue, and so then there's a big correction, but also that the economy will be left in this funny place?
So there's a question around AI revenues. Who does it accrue to at the end of the day? Is it the semiconductor companies? Is it the model companies, the hyperscalers? Is it China? Is it the US? I think that's the number one question. And right now, earnings expectations for all of them are sky high. And there's a likelihood that not all of them will deliver. I think that's the question, and why the market has become so touchy about any narrative that challenges this story of who does the rent accrue to. And we had an illustration of that last week with this new moonshot model, which suggests that, oh, well, maybe you're not going to need as many semiconductors and you're not going to need the US models quite so much. Having said all that, I think we're clearly in the build-up phase. The entire world is building AI infrastructure, and so I think all the companies that are involved in that are going to benefit. But, are the current earnings expectations exactly right? I think one needs to be cautious about this. But the important point to me is it's actually not just an AI story. Okay, that is, and we see this in Europe, where there's much less. There are some companies involved in the AI supply chain, but mostly not. And you still have defense, you have infrastructure, you have energy transition, and all of that is happening at the same time. So the resilience, I think, is actually much more broad-based than people assume when they think, oh, it's all an AI story.
What do you think about when we think about risk or pressure points?
Well, one is clearly inflation. It was very dramatic the way oil prices came down and central bankers relaxed, and you were in Sintra and in X, and all of a sudden the ECB governing council members were like, oh, well, maybe we're done, and that might have been premature relief. If we see central banks having to deliver the rate hikes that are priced by the market, or even maybe go further, that could take some air out of the earnings story that has been, powering stocks. Of course, if we were to see shortages of diesel, that could really hit manufacturing very hard. So we have to remain very watchful of the geopolitical risk and the energy and inflation dangers. But for now, the base case remains one of resilience and central banks having to deliver some hawkishness, but not above and beyond what's currently priced by the market.
Isabelle, what are you expecting from the Fed?
The Fed is going to keep talking hawkish. Our expectation is that they wait until the other side of the midterms to start hiking, and that then they will hike 3 times. No. But the risk is that they decide to go early, and it's very striking how pretty much all the speakers that we heard from last week said they're either ready to hike now or willing to hike if inflation doesn't come down very soon. So we don't expect them to move in July, but let's see. If we don't see an off-ramp in the conflict in the Gulf, and therefore the risk of energy inflation spiking is real, they might decide that it's safer to move now.
Isabelle, thank you so much, as always, for joining us. Isabelle Mateos, Lago from BNP Paribas. Coming up, Andy Burnham becomes a new UK Prime Minister this morning with a cascade of challenges ahead. We'll have plenty more on that next, and this is Bloomberg. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to The Pulse. I'm Francine Lacqua here in London, and these are your top stories. Andy Burnham is set to become the UK's 7th Prime Minister in just over a decade, but questions remain over his policies and, of course, his cabinet. Inflation concerns return after Washington and Tehran exchange more strikes in the Middle East. Washington also confirms 3 U.S. troops have been killed in recent days. And Kelly Ortberg, Boeing's chief executive, tells Bloomberg its next-gen aircraft are not due until towards the end of the next decade, as the company is just not yet financially ready. So, the resumption of U.S. strikes against Iran has thrust incoming U.K. Prime Minister Andy Burnham into a potential day-one decision on how far to back the U.S. military campaign. Let's return to Lizzie Burden, Bloomberg's Daybreak Europe anchor, who's at Downing Street. So, Lizzie, what do you think Burnham's relationship with Trump will be like? A lot of people want to know how the two men will get along or not.
Of course, and Burnham says, Francine, that he's going to be upfront with Trump. I can't imagine that he would go as far as a Hugh Grant Love Actually moment, but certainly something in contrast to the softly approach that Keir Starmer took himself. One of the key questions, you mentioned the US-Iran war, is going to be whether he's going to keep allowing US troops to use British air bases if American troops start striking Iranian civilian infrastructure. But there's also the question of Ukraine. Civil servants expected to advise Burnham to keep the leadership position when it comes to military support, keep the pressure via sanctions on Moscow. And then it comes back to the fiscal. There's still the dilemma of how to ramp up core defence spending to 3.5% of GDP by 2035. That is going to be crucial to showing Trump Burnham is really willing to put his money where his mouth is when it comes to defence.
Lizzie, thank you so much. We're looking at some of the global challenges, and of course, there's a lot to also do, at home. So let's get more with Anand Menon, Director of UK in a Changing Europe, and Adrian, our Bloomberg opinion columnist. So thank you both for joining us. So we also went through, some of the things that Andy Burnham needs to do at home. So there's no transition period in the UK. You literally go in, you start. Does he focus externally to all the things that are happening in the Middle East, or does he just have to make sure that he gets his party on side? Adrian? Internally is the one thing he needs to focus on.
Absolutely, because one of the reasons why Keir Starmer became so unpopular was he was perceived to be over-concerned with the rest of the world and spent more and more of his time as he went on. On foreign relations, collecting the Legion d'honneur and the rest of it. And I think it's really the domestic side that he needs to do. After all, he's a new Prime Minister.
But how does he do that?
Well, I mean, partly it depends on luck, doesn't it? Because we are at the whim of an international system that is increasingly unstable. He's got to hope and pray that things quieten down, that the Strait opens again, that oil prices come down. But at home, I think he's got a majority of 160. It is very, very possible that if he comes in with a plan, he can do some drastic things that start the UK economy growing again. I think the key thing for Andy Burnham is to focus on a few key domestic priorities and show the British public that finally we have a government that's willing to tackle our long-term economic problems.
But can he do that within the fiscal constraints? Because you still have the bond markets and, the fiscal constraints.
No, I mean, the fiscal situation isn't great, obviously. He's going to have to think carefully about how to raise revenue. There's been talk that, for instance, they're going to try and end the triple lock on pensions as a way of raising some money. They're going to have to find a way of generating income. But I think at the same time, with a majority this size, there is a real opportunity for a new Prime Minister to come in and actually tackle some of the issues. He's talked about social care. That has been a blight on our system for decades so far. So we'll have to wait and see whether he comes in ready and willing to tackle some of those challenges.
There's a bigger question as well about whether he can do it within the Labour Party constraints. Right. Is the Labour Party, it's a party of welfare claimants, it's a party of NGOs, it's a party that gets very upset if you take difficult decisions about how to improve productivity. Can he persuade them in the way that Keir Starmer certainly couldn't, that they need to sacrifice short-term things in order to get long-term productivity growth?
Adrian, where do you think Keir Starmer went wrong? Because I know it's the Prime Minister's moment. Andy Burnham is just starting looking at number 10. But if we don't understand exactly where his predecessor failed, it's going to be difficult for him to learn lessons.
Where he really went wrong, first of all, was backing down over relatively modest improvements in the welfare state, in the welfare system, reducing the certain dependencies that people had. And when he showed that he was willing to back down over something small, everything else followed from that, I think.
Do you agree?
I do agree, yeah. I think what that whole episode showed was A, a degree of political weakness, and B, I think a degree of political naivety, because the Prime Minister proved unable to tell a story that appealed to his backbenchers. There are ways of selling welfare reform. What you don't do is go to a bunch of Labour backbenchers and say, we need to save money, we're cutting welfare, which was the narrative that they came out with.
But so what is that, personality? Was it a temperament problem? Because we know he also lost staff within Number 10. Again, Andy Burnham will look at the slate that Keir Starmer left him. What does he do differently?
I think it was partly a temperament issue. Remember, Keir Starmer was selected to be the anti-Boris Johnson. And in that role, he was in many senses perfect, wasn't he? He was a serious, loyally technocratic person, as opposed to Johnson, who was essentially the opposite. It turned out, though, that having someone with no real political vision, with no ability to tell a political story, isn't ideal when that person becomes Prime Minister.
Prime Minister Burnham, does he have that? I mean, it's storytelling, it's persuasion, it's keeping the party together and being able to sell it to the citizens.
He certainly has it when it comes to dealing with his inner staff. When I went to see him once a few years ago in Manchester, and you could get the sense that the staff really liked him and really worked with him very well. I think he has it when it comes to talking to the Labour Party, giving them a sense that they have a story. We don't know whether it's too nationally at the moment. I think one interesting test would be about defence. At the moment, we're being told a story about defence that we need to increase to 3.5% of GDP. What does that mean? We're given no sense of why, what the threat is, what we need to do about it. In Sweden, which I think is a very interesting case, everybody gets through their door, every single citizen gets through their door, something explaining the nature of the threat, particularly from Russia, how they need to prepare for it, how the world has changed. Unless we do that, all of this stuff will seem just like a burden, rather than like something that we need to do.
How's the devolution going to go?
Well, I mean, he's made great play of it. And he's talked about setting up a Number 10 in the north. The north for Andy Burnham seems to mean Manchester, which itself might cause some problems for him, for people from the rest of the UK. I think it is absolutely and obviously the case that the UK is over-centralised, and that accounts for some of the problems we've had. Whether or not he should spend what will be just under 3 years before he has to call an election worrying about changing the machinery of government rather than substantive policy, I think that's an open question. And the final thing I'd say is, of course, when an English Prime Minister starts talking about devolution, hackles raise automatically in Cardiff and particularly in Edinburgh, where they're saying, we are a devolved government, you don't get to tell us how to structure our country. There's
another problem with devolution as well, as I think, is it increases the power of the citizenry to resist change. If you give people... There are a lot of veto points in our system. That just adds more veto points. And some of the improvements in productivity, house building, need to be actually imposed from the centre. I mean, it's an unfortunate paradox, but you need to have an ability to push things through, and devolution may help that, but may well hinder it.
Number 10 in the north, does it help with growth for the country, or does it help with voters?
It's a gimmick.
You agree?
To an extent, yeah. I think the way it's... We have so few details. I mean, the striking thing about Andy Burnham is how little we know about what he intends to do, and he's becoming Prime Minister in a few hours' time. I think there is a case, and a serious and sensible case to be made, for devolving more political and fiscal authority outside of London to the regions. Whether having a prime ministerial office in Manchester is the way to do that, I think I'm less certain. I
mean, what do citizens want? I mean, this felt to me like a direct play in trying to placate Farage and actually get vote. You know, they're getting ready for a general election. When do we know if Andy Burnham is the right guy for this?
The right guy, I mean, I think he is very good at mobilising his core base. He's very good at telling a story. He's much better than his predecessor. I think he's probably the right guy for a general election. Whether he's the right guy to be running the country is a different question.
It should be the same question, though, shouldn't it?
I mean, to an extent, yeah. I think in answer to your question, what people want is they want to see the economy growing. They want to see median wages that have flatlined since 2008 going up again. They want to see public services improving, and that will be the real test. It might turn out that Andy Burnham turns out to be a really lucky general because, of course, his accession to power coincides with the strange disappearance of Nigel Farage, who's hounded with all these stories about payments he's received, and Reform have come down in the polls from their peak in last August. And at the same time, the other challenge from the populist left, Zach Polanski, leader of the Green Party, is, at a minimum, far less ubiquitous on our airwaves these days than he was when he became Green leader. So it might be that Andy Burnham has become Prime Minister at what is quite a good time for him.
So imagine if he won the World Cup.
No,
I know, well, you didn't do too badly. We didn't do too badly against France, so maybe that gives him also a little bit of a boost this week. What kind of cabinet does he have to form? So does it have to be loyalists? The Chancellor is extremely important in this, but does he have to please the markets or please Labour?
he has to please the markets, I think, first. He can please Labour in other ways, but I think when it comes to choosing the Chancellor, he has to please the markets first and foremost. The broader cabinet will be a difficult balancing job, but I think he can please his backbenchers without going for a very left-wing progressive cabinet, I think.
I think there's a tension there, isn't there? I mean, ideally, if you're asking me what he should do, he should keep people who are familiar with their brief and done a good job in position. The reality of politics means that's going to be very, very difficult to do because he has to sort of give rewards to his allies and make sure that his friends are getting the jobs they expect. I think the cabinet this afternoon will be Andy Burnham's first introduction to the fact that being Prime Minister means irritating people, whether you like it or not, because some people simply won't get the jobs they want, and that will start the process of people muttering against
And
him.
he does have a big gender balance issue. I think you will have to, because we've heard the Labour Party doesn't seem to have put women into the very top job, and I think that is a rankling with people.
And who would you have kept, actually, who would you keep from the Starmer cabinet?
Well, the one thing that strikes me is, by her own measures, Shabana Mahmood has been quite effective as Home Secretary. She's got a handle on the brief. I just think, in general, we've seen this profound turbulence in our politics over the last decade, that shifting ministers around is not a recipe for effective governance because it takes people time to learn their brief. These things are complicated jobs, OK? You can't just walk in and be able to do it from day one. So I tend to favour stability, but I realise that's probably why I'm not a leading politician, because that ignores the political reality of having to sort of deal with...
I agree 100% with that, except I think we need a new Chancellor. And then everything moves around after that. We can't keep the same Chancellor.
But it'd be a Chancellor that needs to be more innovative, more, how does the next Chancellor need to do? Because, again, they were kind of boxed in, right? These budgets were neither pleasing, their centre party or the right or the left. It was all a little bit of everything because they were chasing voters.
I think what we need is a Chancellor who's willing to be bolder. Rachel Reeves was pretty tentative. Some of the things she did moved us sort of gently in the right direction. This is a time for bold action. As I said, this is an economy that basically hasn't grown since 2008. Absolutely. It's an economy in bad need of reform. Yeah. Who knows when we'll get another government with a majority of this size that allows it to actually do things. So I think a Chancellor with more ambition is what the country is really in need of.
And who projects more of a sense of self-confidence and vision, which we didn't get from this Chancellor.
So what does business need, and also what does it mean for Europe? Too big. We're kind of like cramming these two big portfolios. But first of all, the business, the City of London, what will they be looking out for this afternoon?
Well, we seem to have a country run by NGOs and run by regulators, and I think we need to have a sense that it's also run for business. And I think business feels very strongly that it's been marginalised, that there are too many regulations, or too many fiddly regulations that are unnecessary, and there's not a sense of dynamism and not a sense of addressing productivity problems and harnessing the will of business to try and address these productivity problems. I think that Sunak was beginning to do a lot of those sort of things. I think we sort of gently go back to some of those initiatives.
But it's difficult if, you have a Labour Party that also wants to make the society fairer. So again, you
can't make society fairer without addressing... Paul Krugman once said, productivity is not everything, but it's almost everything. And I think that that's true here.
On Europe?
On Europe, it's interesting because we've reached a point where the previous government, or the Starmer government, the current government still...
for a couple of hours.
The negotiations it was having with the European Union over its so-called reset were proving very, very difficult indeed. I wouldn't be surprised if a Prime Minister Burnham deprioritises that set of negotiations with the EU, because his future will be decided by what he delivers domestically. And I think it is those domestic reforms where he's going to focus the most of his attentions.
But failed prime ministers retreat into foreign policy and European policy, I think, which Starmer did to some extent, and I think he will absolutely focus on domestic issues at first. They're the people with the votes.
But Adrian, you could argue that actually if you deal with the US, or if you need some kind of trade deal with America, then you need to play that game, certainly when it comes to the Trump presidency.
I don't think a trade deal with the US is particularly on the cards at the moment. It'll be interesting, as you said right at the start, to see how Andy Burnham tries to handle Donald Trump. What I do think is looming on the horizon are some difficult choices between the US and the EU that are going to confront us. Our foreign policy since the Second World War has been about not choosing. Increasingly, with Trump in the White House, with the EU acting to protect itself from what it sees as a hostile America, we're in danger of being caught in the middle. And there are already some things the EU is doing to protect itself from China and the US that are impacting us. And is uncomfortable.
I think Britain always tends to overemphasize its importance to the rest of the world. We're not as important as we think we are. And a lot of this stuff, the important intricate work, particularly of improving relations with Europe, can be done through back channels, be done by the deep state rather than the Prime Minister.
So interesting. Thank you both for joining us today. Anand Menon, Director of UK and a Changing Europe, and Adrian Wooldridge, Bloomberg opinion columnist. Now, coming up, as Alibaba launches a new artificial intelligence model, we'll get the latest on the rise of China's AI capabilities. That's coming up next, and this is Bloomberg. The U.S. and Iran traded fresh attacks over the weekend until Washington announced a third troop death in 2 days. Now, Tehran says it will no longer adhere to the terms of the peace deal, while President Trump says the conflict is about ending Iran's nuclear ambitions.
This is a far bigger job that we're doing. We were doing a little job of stopping them from having a certain capability. Now we're just ending it. So it's really not the same thing. What we're doing now is we're ending any chance where they could have a nuclear missile.
Well, let's get the latest with Paul Wallace, Bloomberg's managing editor for the Middle East and Africa. Paul, thank you for joining us. So Iran says the ceasefire has effectively collapsed. Bring us up to speed on the attacks this weekend.
Hi, Francine. Well, we've just seen daily attacks by the U.S. and counter-strikes from Iran on places like Kuwait and Bahrain and Jordan and Iraq. And it seems as if neither side is backing down at the moment. This latest flare-up, and we're now into the 9th straight day of U.S. strikes on Iran, it's down to Hormuz. That is what the focus of this war is right now, and the focus of what diplomacy still exists between Iran and the U.S. The U.S. is trying to force open the strait and get Iran to stop its maritime attacks, but Iran does not look like it's in any mind to do that, and keeps insisting that it wants to control traffic going through that vital waterway. It sees it as a key source of leverage over the U.S. and also sees it as vital to its own national security. So we could see more escalation from here. In fact, that's what Donald Trump has threatened. He's essentially said that the U.S. is going to step up the scope and the intensity of its attacks, perhaps each day, until Iran relents. Now, in the last few moments, in the last hour, Iran has mentioned that mediators have sent some ideas to it, and one of its ministers is traveling to Pakistan today, Pakistan being one of the main mediators alongside Qatar. But details are very light at the moment, and it's unclear whether this is enough to move the needle and stop these two countries from escalating this war even further.
So, Paul, I mean, I was going to ask you about escalation. Do we have any sense of where, this war goes next, and what's making it through the Strait of Hormuz?
So traffic is very much down again, and it's, to be honest, the numbers have dwindled to what we were seeing at the height of the conflict in March and early April, with very few ships going through, and the U.S. is back to blockading Iran's ports. In terms of escalation, I think the most obvious thing is you would see the U.S. go beyond sort of southern Iran and focusing mainly on military targets to perhaps bombing Tehran again and other major cities such as Isfahan. And on Iran's side, you'd probably see widespread counterstrikes if it did decide to escalate beyond Kuwait and Bahrain and Jordan and Iraq, and perhaps countries like Saudi Arabia and Qatar and the UAE being hit on a bigger scale. That's if both sides decides to escalate. There's no guarantee of that, and they may well decide to ease tensions, perhaps because of what's happening in energy markets with crude and fuel prices once again jumping heavily.
Paul, thank you so much. Paul Wallace there, Bloomberg's managing editor for the Middle East and Africa. Now, Ryanair says profit dropped by 34% in its fiscal first quarter as the Middle East conflict hikes the price of oil and dents consumers' desire to travel. Neil Soranan, the chief financial officer, spoke to us earlier.
On the availability, there's no shortage of fuel. There hasn't been any shortage of fuel. I think there was some concerns about that earlier on in the year. No difficulty at all on that front. As I said, very well hedged at $67 a barrel, 80% of our fuel hedged, but importantly, 90% of our dollar requirements hedged out to the end of this year at 115. The 20% unhedged, we don't know where it'll go. It had dipped after the MOU was signed. We were already hedging into FY28 since the conflict escalated over the past couple of weeks. The price has spiked again. I think it's over 90 on Brent, which means it's well over $100 a barrel on jet fuel this morning. But we're better hedged than everybody else. I think a lot of capacity is going to come out of the market this winter, and I think inevitably you may see some airlines go to the wall.
Okay, and let me ask you about the demand story then. We've seen some customer hesitancy in the first quarter, understandably around the war, and lots of other airlines talking about that as well. Are you going to have to try to stimulate demand? Is that going? And you've been doing a bit of that, I suppose. But is that going to have to continue?
I think it's at a slightly lower level. We're talking about the trend into Q2 being modestly down. That's a low single-digit number. Now, it could be better, could be slightly worse. It all very much depends on the close-in bookings into August and September. And unfortunately, with people booking that little bit later, we don't have huge visibility on that at this point in time.
Any sense that people are booking a little further ahead? You know, they changed their behaviour when the war started, booked very last minute. Any sense that that's changing at all? I
think they're hoping to get a bargain at the last minute, but the reality is if you book close in, you're going to pay up. So my advice to everybody this morning is to book now as quickly as possible, or you're going to end up paying significantly higher fares closer in.
Lizzie Burnham's in Downing Street. Any message for a new Prime Minister, Neil, in the UK?
I think he has a phenomenal opportunity to grow tourism and to grow jobs in the UK by getting rid of APD in the first week in office.
Well, that was Ryanair CFO Neil Sarahan speaking to Bloomberg's Anna Edwards earlier this morning. Now, Alibaba has released a preview version of its flagship model, which it describes as second only to Anthropic's Fable 5. Chinese startup Moonshot released its own powerful offering last week. Joining us now is Matt Bloxham, senior analyst with Bloomberg Intelligence. Matt, as always, thank you so much for joining us. So when you look at, the latest AI model launches out of China, should we worry?
Yeah, I think we should. I mean, also it's been a big week or so for models out of China with that Kimi K3 from Moonshot and the Alibaba Qwen3.8 Max, which are claiming to be, as good as pretty much everything except for Anthropic's Fable 5. That's still seen as a leader. But when you look at the independent analysis, the suggestions at least initially are that these aren't much far behind. And I think significantly these models are open source, which means that basically a company can take those models and adjust the assumptions and parameters for their own needs, whereas Anthropic and OpenAI, they're closed models. So I think the combination of the performance, the cost, so they're anything up to 90% cheaper than the US models, and this customization opportunity is kind of really grabbing the attention of a lot more big international firms, not just the Chinese.
So what are the big implications for the US hyperscalers?
Yeah, so I think obviously this starts to kind of raise more questions about the kind of mid to long-term market share of the US models versus the Chinese. I think, potentially along the way, if we do see a lot more US and perhaps European companies start to use Chinese models, that may kind of raise more scrutiny from the US administration. Not impossible that at some point you might see controls on the use of Chinese software come into play the same way we've seen it with the technology, because this does threaten, given that the Chinese models are knocking on the door of Anthropic, they could easily overtake them in the next maybe kind of year or so, and that I think would be a really significant shift and would definitely kind of raise concerns in the US administration.
Matt, thank you so much, as ever, for joining us. Matt Bloxham there, senior analyst with Bloomberg Intelligence. Now, let's also check on some of the futures that we're looking at in the U.S. Look, Anthropic is, of course, one of the big ones we're watching. But overall, there's just a lot of earnings to get through, and that could give us an indication of some of these valuations. Alphabet kicking off reporting from AI hyperscalers for the second quarter on Wednesday. Up next, it's Bloomberg Brief, and this is Bloomberg.